Hi, my name is Bryan Legare. I am a marine researcher at the Center for Coastal Studies up in Provincetown. We are getting similar winds and cold up there, so it's, it's winter now. So I'm here to talk to you today about sharks, shark science, and where we stand on shark science on Cape Cod. This summer was a very intense summer for sharks. There was a lot of sharks seen around Cape Cod, and there was a couple incidences in which one individual lost his life due to a shark bite off while he was boogie boarding. One thing that I'm going to really focus on today is really just talking about shark science, not necessarily shark or seal management, but more what questions and what ideas are being discussed, looked at, and studied, and what questions and ideas we can look at in the future. And one thing I'm going to really focus on is different tools and stuff that we get to use. So today, I'm going to do a brief overview of sharks and what sharks are. They're more than just great white sharks. Past projects that I have worked on throughout different systems. Sharks in the Gulf of Maine. So we're not necessarily in the Gulf of Maine, we're kind of on the crux there. But a lot of them are applicable down here as well. White shark science on Cape Cod, where that has gone in the recent decade, over the last number of years with a lot of collaborators. And what are the next questions on shark science that we at the center with other collaborators would like to look at? So sharks, one question we always have is why are they important? Why do we care about managing sharks in for a more sustainable way? Marine ecosystems are suffering loss of predators worldwide. Just like the wolves of Yellowstone, sharks have a top-down pressure on the ecosystems that they live in to help regulate the different species in that. Sharks play an important role as those top predators. And it's suggested that overfishing of sharks and other large predators can lead to degradation of habitats all over the world from different ecosystems. Sharks are, as a shark scientist, I have a appreciation for the multitude of sharks. They're cartilaginous fish. They don't have solidified bones as a skeleton. They have a cartilage skeleton. There are over 400 species of sharks throughout the world in just about every oceanic habitat, and there's even 4 species of sharks known to inhabit fresh water, several in Southeast Asia, and we all know about the bull shark's ability to go into freshwater systems. They have a wide range of different niches in ecosystems, from top predators to mid-level predators. There's even a shark called the Bonnethead, hammerhead shark, which only gets about yay big, that has found to actually ingest and digest seagrasses. So it's the first omnivore shark, and this paper just came out earlier this year. So where you think sharks fit in the ecosystem changes as we learn more about these individuals. But they generally are what we consider K-selected, which is that they have few young, and they are slow to mature, and they often utilize different nursery habitats and have diverse breeding strategies, which all of these characteristics can lead to exploitation. They are big and they are small. We have some of the larger sharks. The largest is the whale shark, which is a really cool fish. It's the largest fish in the world. But a local resident often gets oversighted, in my opinion, because it's a really cool animal, is the basking shark. And we have those in our waters around here, often mistaken for other species that sometimes are people are more afraid of. Down to the smallest sharks, which are only 7 or 8 inches to different pygmy and lantern sharks, which tend to be much deeper water animals, but they're all classified as sharks. We have several of these species that have occur in our waters, the white sharks and the basking sharks, and several threshers and makos and whatnot, and these comprise of some of the larger sharks in the world. So sharks, again, aren't just white sharks. There are many different sharks, and they all occupy different niches throughout the systems. And as my background and what I did during my master's and continuing doing some research now is study different shark nursery habitats throughout the area. And as it gets colder, I like to reminisce about my time down in the Virgin Islands studying juvenile sharks in different nursery habitats. Nursery habitats are really important as they provide space and food for the sharks to outgrow the most vulnerable period of their life. While they're young, they are subject to predators throughout their system, so they need these areas as a safe haven to potentially increase survival to maturity. Once a shark is large, there's fewer predators that can actually prey upon it, except for other larger sharks. And what we did is we utilized different technologies. Tools are one of the things I really like to investigate and go in. So we used acoustic telemetry. So this is a tag, and this tag emits a pulse every 60 to 180 seconds at a random interval, and it has a number associated with that pulse. So when we implant this into a little shark and it pings, we can identify that shark by its unique serial number as it passes by a receiver. So these receivers will listen for this pinger as it travels throughout a system of interest. So this is very similar technology that we'll get to when we start talking about local sharks and local shark science on Cape Cod and the islands. What we're able to do with this is track them over time and look at how they utilize habitats. And how they utilize habitats allows us to understand how to protect and manage different fish and different species during this period of life. What we were able to find in the islands when we looked at 2 different species of sharks were different home ranges throughout the year for each species in a similar habitat, which we found that they didn't share space equally. They weren't sharing resources. They were partitioning resources. So if we wanted to protect blacktips within Coral Bay, I don't know if anyone's been to St. John, but this is the east end of St. John. If you like a nice bar, it's called Skinny Legs. It's right about here. Fantastic burgers with chips because they don't have a fryer. But the blacktips are right by the Skinny Legs dock, occupying one of the most productive shark nursery areas in the Virgin Islands. And then the lemon sharks are down by Johnson's Bay, down towards the mouth. They are both very similar habitats, but they don't use them equally. They partition one space for the blacktips and one space for the lemons, which allows us to understand and manage the system better. As we looked at their home range, we had other questions on what they're doing throughout the day. So we're looking at the Finescale movement. And we found that while the blacktips are within the habitat on a day-to-day basis, what they do is as the sun goes down, the second the sun sets, they shoot out towards the center of the bay, and they are potentially foraging out in this other area, and then they slowly make their way back in a very repeatable manner. So these sharks are exhibiting very specific behaviors in this system. So if I want to go and find a shark in Coral Bay, during the day, I'm going to stay up by Skinny Legs. And at night, I'm going to go out towards the mouth of the bay. So it allows us to understand how they may be getting caught in fisheries or preyed upon by larger sharks. So we really understood how they moved within the system of Coral Bay using this technology, these tools. But we had a question of what do they do afterwards? What do they do when they leave the bay? And because this technology is so universally used by multiple different organizations, we were able to track them beyond the shores of St. John. We were able to track them throughout the system, down to the shelf edge. Where we had receivers, we were able to find where the sharks moved. They moved towards Puerto Rico, out by Vieques and Culebra, and we were also able to find them moving from St. John all the way up to the east coast of the United States between a couple different recaptures, so someone manually recapturing the fish, or the acoustic telemetry. And this allows us to understand the broader movements of the shark and what areas the Virgin Islands supplied to a bigger ecosystem. So sharks that are caught here might be products of here. So proper monitoring is needed for things like, for sharks like blacktips and lemons on a bigger scale. So that's my background in really looking at the fine scale and long distance movement of sharks. So a couple years ago, I ended up on the Cape at the Center for Coastal Studies in the seafloor mapping program. And we have sharks on the Cape. We have many different sharks on the Cape and around the islands. We have sand tigers in the nearshore habitat, white sharks, basking sharks, spiny dogfish. Spiny dogfish are sharks. Often people don't think of them like that, but they are really cool and important fish for both fisheries and the ecosystem. We have mid-Atlantic, what I call mid-Atlantic visitors, which are probably more abundant here than up where I'm at in Provincetown. Include tiger sharks, Atlantic sharp-nosed, bonnetheads, which are those omnivorous sharks that I mentioned earlier. Cat sharks, smooth dogfish, multitude of different things. We have different open ocean sharks, deep water sharks, and many things that have shown up in our waters, mainly through fishing gear. And over time, they were and are an important fishery, which peaked in the 1980s after heavy capitalization of the US fishing fleet once we established our exclusive economic zone. So we had a very big peak of fish caught in the early 80s and a rapid decline over time. So this is all sharks caught in New England commercially, excluding dogfish, because dogfish have a different trend than this, and generally not talking about them right now. But we see how changes in fisheries have affected these populations over time. So we have many different sharks. We have many different pressures on these sharks. Their populations have changed over time, but other animals have changed in our ecosystems over time, including seals. So seals, most of us, when we go to the beach now, we see seals. They are a presence in our ecosystem. We have year-round residents to the Cape and Islands of gray seals, but their range includes from the North Atlantic to the Baltic Sea, and for our core population here is really from Newfoundland down to Virginia is where the gray seal population is. And you really can't think of it as a Nantucket seal or a Cape Cod seal. You really have to think of it as a Northwest Atlantic seal because they're a part of a larger population. They can, and seals were popular, populations were decimated for over a century throughout New England. From 1888 to 1962, Massachusetts had a bounty on seals, which paid money to go cull seals off of different areas. And that really stopped in the early 60s when we ran out of seals. And a few years after they ended the bounty, they passed an act, Massachusetts passed an act before the Marine Mammal Protection Act, preventing seals and other marine mammals from being harvested. And in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act broadened that protection beyond Massachusetts, allowing for the rebound of and repopulation of these seals from elsewhere. So these are local seals down in Muskeget. and how pupping has changed over time from 1991 to 2008. And as you can see, over time, it has had a dramatic increase of these guys back into the ecosystem. Seals, like I said, they range from Newfoundland. These gray seals, this population ranges from Newfoundland all the way down to Virginia. And it's estimated over 500,000 seals in that overall population. And they're locally, and I was at a shark public forum last night, and these numbers are still holding to be pretty accurate, around 23 to 27,000 seals on Cape Cod and the islands in Massachusetts waters, based off of, that's a minimum number in these areas. And there is lots of exchange between Cape Cod and the rest of the system. There has been tracked seals within a week between Newfoundland and Cape Cod during the breeding season. So when we talk about seals on Cape Cod and the islands, we're not talking about seals that are strictly resident here. We're talking about a bigger population that moves back and forth within each other. Seals are dynamic. They are a part of the ecosystem, and they have ups and downs in population. And what we're seeing this year is an unusual mortality event throughout the Gulf of Maine. So seals, as their population goes up, can encounter different population, different diseases and different things. And right now, we've had a large number of strandings and deaths of seals throughout Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and some in Rhode Island from what is known as phocine distemper virus. One thing about seals is they can carry different diseases. Phocine distemper isn't, we can't catch it, but your pets can. So it's very important, again, to stay away from the seals and stay a good distance away from them for both the seal's health and safety and yourself and your pet's health and safety of these, because of things that they may carry. And if you do have any specific seal questions, I'm not a seal scientist. I presented some seal information from some colleagues and stuff like that, but the best place to get that is NASERC, which is the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium, which is a big group of different research facilities and scientists throughout New England. And they can answer your questions on specific, more specific questions. So we have sharks, we have seals. We had a reduction of sharks from the 80s, and we had a reduction of seals throughout our history. But where are we now with white sharks? Because seems to be the big topic at hand, are white sharks and what are they doing with their population as they're in our waters. So where does it stand? White sharks are widely distributed globally in temperate and tropical waters. They have seasonal aggregations often associated with feeding and water temperature. So throughout the world, so we're here. We have a nice little, we have an aggregation that occurs off of Cape Cod. California also has a similar group based off around sea lion distributions in Hollowts, California. Down in Patagonia, South Africa, west coast of Australia, and Japan. They all have these populations of white sharks that are seasonally aggregating based on food and temperature. So we are not unique in having these type of populations, but we are unique in where we are in its rebound. So where are they when we're talking about our sharks, our Northwest Atlantic sharks? And what we have to do is we have to look at historic documents. A colleague of mine, Toby Curtis with the National Marine Fisheries Service, did his PhD looking at this, and he looked at the historic confirmed sightings of sharks throughout the Northwest Atlantic and tried to understand, was the population going up, going down, and where were they seasonally and locally. And what he found is that they were found from Newfoundland to the British Virgin Islands, and they were very seasonally tied to the temperature. So you weren't finding sharks in Newfoundland in January, but you were finding sharks in the Northeast during the summer. So the temperatures were fine. And he found that there was a distinct line of abundance. So a lot of this was both through fisheries, fishers, observers, so individuals saying, I found a shark, I got a picture, I caught the shark, here's a picture, and some confirmed sightings. And also fisheries dependent data, so observers seeing sharks over time and things caught and landed in different areas. But what we found is there was a decline over time up until the 90s, and then there was a fisheries management plan put in place in the early 90s for white sharks, and then there was a prohibition on their capture in the late 90s, and after that we've started seeing an increase in the white shark abundance. So again, I like tools, I like answering questions, and biology, and you have to often use a lot of interesting tools to answer different questions. So here we talked about where are they, how are they, so there's a lot of historic data they have to look through. But how old are they is always an interesting question when it especially comes to fish, because they're not going to tell you, they don't have a birth certificate, but they kind of do. And one of the most interesting things that we have been able to use as a tool for aging long-lived fish and organisms is the atmospheric nuclear atmospheric testing that was done peaked in the 60s. So this laid a nice level of radiation throughout the world, which was absorbed and bioaccumulated in different animals. And by finding this pattern in the vertebra of sharks, they were able to identify how long these fish were alive for. And they were able to age some of these sharks to 40 to 73 years. So they had 14 vertebrae that covered this time frame, and able to slice them, dice them, and analyze them, and gotten a validation for the bands that are in the vertebra. So now you can go forward and count the bands on the sharks, because we validate it using these unique tools that we had, looking at the radiation. And from that, so we figured out how we can age them, and then they did a larger study. This is work done by Dr. Greg Skomel and Elisa Natanson, and they found that looking at 81 different white shark vertebrae, they can live in excess of 70 years. So these sharks are older than we thought they could be, and slower to mature than we thought they could be. So we know, so we're learning, how many we had, where they were generally distributed historically. We now know how long they can live and how late they can mature for our population, because each population throughout the world will be a little bit different. So now the current work that is starting to wrap up is how many do we have? So the biggest task as marine biologists we have is being able to count, which sounds a lot hard, a lot easier than it is, but we often have to count things that we can't see, and things that move fast and aren't normally distributed. So current work on the Cape is looking at identifying those sharks during a 5-year period of time of how many are utilizing Massachusetts waters, primarily Cape Cod and the islands. And they use aerial planes, aerial surveys twice a week to count and video identify individual species of sharks throughout the system. And what they've found so far, they've identified at least 320 individuals, last I knew, but they haven't gone through all the data yet because it's very time consuming. And they're going to use statistical modeling to understand how many sharks are probably utilizing nearshore Cape Cod on the backside. So a lot of this work hasn't been done within the bay, We know that they go in the bay. We didn't know they come down through Nantucket, but that's that. And what they found is that they move, sharks that we meet on Cape Cod move up and down the East Coast, and we've tagged a lot of sharks with acoustic and pop-up telemetry to see how they're moving. So we don't just use the spotter planes and the video arrays. We use, as scientists, we use different technologies like the acoustic telemetry and satellite telemetry, which can allow us to understand the broad scale distributions of these sharks. So these sharks move broadly from nearshore Cape Cod off to the shelf. They can do deep diving throughout each day, and movements can often be associated with temperature and foraging behavior. It's often thought that the sharks that move along up and down the East Coast are primarily feeding on, porpoises and fishes and different prey items like that. And the ones that are doing these long searches offshore are possibly scavenging off of whale carcasses and other fishes and stuff like that. So they do have a much broader diet than we realize, with primarily consuming seals as they're up here. And as you can see, they make some broad movements away from the East Coast. And seasonally, what you can see is they're hugging Cape Cod during the summer. So it's something about this area here is they're really enjoying during the summer, just like the majority of us enjoy Cape Cod throughout the summer. And when they're in these open ocean habitats, they are utilizing different parameters in which they will do deep water diving, foraging for prey, and they're often associated with these warm water eddies that occur throughout the systems, which can reduce stress on their bodies and stress on their systems. So it tells you that the shark will often utilize areas that have both food and will be less stressful on their bodies to not expend too much energy. So the mature sharks that we've tagged off of Cape Cod and the islands, they make broad movements. They make seasonal distributions where they're near shore during the summer and these broader movements throughout the rest of the year. But what do the juveniles do? As a scientist who likes juvenile sharks and juvenile habitats, what we're finding is that the juveniles are potentially setting up off of Long Island and south of Long Island with a higher distribution, a higher abundance of juvenile sharks in this area compared to other areas, and they tend to be sticking around for a period of time. It's still too early in the research to identify this as a shark nursery area, but preliminary, it might be a place worth investigating. So we're right in between the mature feeding habitats of Cape Cod and the nursery habitats just off of Long Island as we sit here on Nantucket. So we know where they're moving, how old they are, how many we had in the past, but this is always the most interesting topic is what do they eat? When seal populations was low, it was thought that white sharks were primarily, large mature white sharks were primarily scavenging dead whales and hunting smaller dolphins and whales throughout the Northwest Atlantic. So forcing them to do these broad scale, long distance movements in search for these rich, very important food sources. And at the center, we've documented several whales that were scavenged by white sharks in Cape Cod Bay and nearby. This shark here, this whale here, is a minke whale. 24 hours earlier was an untouched minke whale. It was a fresh death. So understanding the predation of these, I shouldn't say predation, the scavenging of these dead whale carcasses can allow us to understand how quickly they return that energy back into the system and become a bigger part of the ecosystem. So a dead whale is sad, but it's in instances like these that the energy gets passed back into the crabs and the snails and the fishes and the sharks and stuff. So that's the historic idea, is that they mainly scavenged and went after fishes in the open ocean. Presently, with the rebound of the seal population, what we have is the white sharks diversifying their diet from more marine mammal whale to now seal, whale, fishes, and stuff like that, as they have a reliable food source here off the Cape. So marine mammals, we think of white sharks as mainly eating marine mammals, but actually they eat a lot of fishes, including mainly the juveniles and immature sharks, almost primarily exclusively eat fish. What they do is they fish 10 feet or sharks 10 feet or less are mainly fish consumers and scavengers. They'll eat dead whales and dead sharks and stuff like that, but they're too small to really go after a seal and whatnot. They might try, but what we're finding is that there's a lot of incidences of charter fishermen and recreational fishers, their catch being grabbed recently by some smaller white sharks. This was a famous stranding of a very young white shark up on the Cape that was released and tagged and is, I believe, still pinging out there after that incident. And then this was a shark I was able to join in on a necropsy earlier this summer up in Truro on the bay side of Cape Cod. It was about a just over 9-foot shark, and it was after the necropsy we found there wasn't really anything wrong with the shark. What we think is it was probably hunting in the really shallow waters, probably chasing fish, and got stranded and ended up passing away. And this is some of the type of imagery and stuff we're able to do at the center with a lot of the spatial data we have using a technique called photogrammetry. I just really like the spinning shark. So we know what they're eating. We know broad scale where they're moving. We know seasonally where they're moving. But what are they doing while they're here? And there are receivers on Nantucket in the Vineyard throughout Buzzards Bay. This will be updated once the division downloads all their receivers for the 2018 season. But what we're finding is that there is a high concentration of sharks off of the Nauset Pleasant Bay area, but they are found throughout all these systems. They do come down to Nantucket, but what they're finding is that they're mainly passing through Nantucket while they're here. So those are some questions on why they're not stopping here for longer visits. And what we're finding is that they are basically so this is from the Mark and Recapture study that only looks for sharks from Race Point all the way down the Monomoy. And as you can see, they're pretty abundant from one point all the way from the south all the way to the north. There's no real place that you say, that you won't find a shark. But what we're finding is that the concentrations are down here as what we call the hot spots. So we know the areas in which to focus our Finescale research based off of where we're more likely to find these sharks. And the first advances in the Finescale research that they starting to do is with this thing called the shark cam, in which they tagged the shark and they had an AUV follow the shark for up to 8 hours, which was some really, really cool Finescale data, but it's temporally limited because you're only able to track it for a small period of time. But that gave us some insight into how they move into these shallow water areas while hugging the deeper waters just further offshore. So to review, we know where they were historically through historic catches. We know that the population rebounded after the fishing pressure was released on both seals and sharks. We know that the white sharks can live over 70 years old. We have a good understanding of what they eat, but there are questions that we don't have a handle on and need to do some more research on, and that's where we would like to focus some of the research efforts in the future. So what do we not know? We don't know how they utilize the nearshore area on a fine scale basis. So how are they using the troughs? How are they using the tides, the waves, what affects their presence? Does the nearshore morphology of Cape Cod, which is constantly changing, it's constantly changing down here too, affect their presence of sharks? So does a certain type of bed form affect how the shark is going to swim through an area, which will affect the way it can hunt? So as you can see, down by Nauset Marsh, which is what we call a nodal point where all the sand moves north or south and erodes at this point, does the bed forms which are more perpendicular to the shoreline versus along the shoreline, does that affect how the sharks are present and able to hunt in these different areas? At the center, I am a biologist stuck in the geology department. I don't necessarily say stuck unless my boss is around to give him a little hard time. And what I'm able to do is understand this bridge between the biologic and the geologic. And in the C4 mapping program at the center, what we have is some really cool tools, really cool toys. We have a sonar that allows us to take both a picture of the ocean floor and do the bathymetry, the topography of the ocean floor on very fine scale, down to several centimeters. So we can do the nearshore areas, nearshore habitat, looking at the bathymetry and the habitats, and then overlay that on different maps. And this is some imagery we have from Chatham Harbor, looking at some eelgrass areas that they were potentially dredging in. And these ripples are just feet high. So we're able to get a very broad area on a very fine scale to identify the different troughs in different areas that these fish could potentially use. And we can even pick out things like eelgrass in different habitats in the bathymetry, which is pretty remarkable. And we can go very shallow. So this is a imagery from Herring River. This center area is called the nadir, which is the water column. This is less than half a meter deep. So we take our boats into very shallow water and use this technology to map these shallow water habitats to very fine detail. And then when we have these intertidal zones, what we can do is use different drone technologies to map the intertidal area to connect the subtidal and intertidal to get a complete picture of the geomorphology of the nearshore habitat down to several centimeters. These were some oyster grow-out cages, and they were about 10 centimeters tall, and we're able to get very fine-scale resolution of habitats. And you guys remember last winter, we had a very stormy winter. We lost a lot of dunes up in Provincetown, and this is data we collected before, it was February 28th. We took the pre, and then at the end of March we did the post, and we lost hundreds of meters of dune up in Provincetown. And we're able to use the tools that we have at the center to create these very fine scale maps. So when someone asks me, like, so are the sharks going to be utilizing this type of beach? We have to first understand what type of beach we have and what type of beach they're using at the same time, and link the two data sets. And then the other part is, a shark isn't going to be, as we saw from offshore research, isn't going to be in areas that it's more stressed and not as comfortable and using more energy than needed. So are there oceanographic conditions that are more favorable to a shark presence? So are there tide regimes? Is it an incoming tide or outgoing tide that's more likely to be near shore? Are there different currents? Is it a parallel current or a strong current or a weak current that's more likely to go into these areas? Are there different wave regimes and wind regimes? And at the center, we have a piece of equipment called an Acoustic Doppler current profiler, which measures the speed and direction of the current throughout the water column and waves and currents. So placing this out into the ocean and overlaying it with the tracking data that colleagues at the Division of Marine Fisheries have, we can really start to answer some of these questions. So the next questions that we would like to answer are like, why are the sharks utilizing these areas more so than other areas? And then when we understand that, we can infer that to different areas, such as on Nantucket. At the center, we have the tools to answer these types of questions. So I can leave it up to some questions.
You mentioned that there are sensors off of Nantucket as well as other places. Is there a website or something that the public can go to and see what the sensors are and what kind of results they got from them?
So the Division of Marine Fisheries manages that data set, and they will yearly update, and I believe it's mainly their yearly report, DMF report, that you can actually go and find how many detections were found and how many different sharks in different areas and locations and stuff like that. So it's ongoing. The thing about these receivers is they're not real time. Real time is a thing that would be cool to have, but what you have to do is you set it, you forget it, you come back to it, and it's like opening up a Christmas present to see what sharks are there. So we have weird Christmas in biology. So it's nothing in real time, but yes, DMF has a white shark webpage that you can find a lot of the data on. Yeah.
I have two questions. When you talked about there was a bounty on hunting seals,
Mm-hmm.
why were they hunted?
They were thought to be a nuisance.
They were what?
Thought to be a nuisance to both fisheries and several other things. From a bounty point, no. There was hunting that went on from a period of time, but primarily in Massachusetts, what reduced the seal numbers was the bounty, which was you can kill a seal, bring it in the nose, and get some money.
My other question was, do sharks travel in a group, in a school, or are they lone?
So white sharks are generally solitary. They generally don't follow each other, and when you see a couple together, it's generally either a coincidence or rare. Yeah.
On your nearshore morphology that you were talking about, I'm assuming the data is relatively recent. Have you come up with any hypothesis or any data that shows where they're?
So the data that exists right now, especially for the backside of the Cape, is a lot coarser than what we would like to look at these things. And it's generally from LiDAR, which is done every so often by the USGS and a couple, maybe other entities. What we would like to do is the data doesn't exist yet. So we would like to utilize the equipment that we have at the center once we get funding and stuff in place to map these areas in very fine scale and sub-meter, because these sharks are moving in sub-meter. And the next goal of Skomel and his group is to intensify some receiver arrays so you can actually triangulate how they move. So if we take that triangulation and overlay it at the same time of a current habitat map and current oceanographic conditions, we can really get to some of these questions on why are they present more during certain times of day and not.
Do you know if those conversations are going on or how far they've gotten with regard to putting in further arrays? I know that Greg has wanted to put in some stuff out here.
They're moving constantly. I was at a meeting yesterday prior to a public forum in which we were discussing intensifying arrays on the backside. I think Nantucket came up on his discussions on getting more out here. The details of that are more for him to know, but yeah, we would like to, as a fish scientist, we would like to wire up everywhere. And through cooperative collaborations, it kind of is happening spotty from Nova Scotia all the way down to Florida. But it's the more we have, the better. Yeah.
That leads into my second question, which was the forum last night. What was the vibe?
It was a good forum. It was there's still some raw emotion from the summer, which is completely there. But it was a lot of really good questions about like how do we move forward, how can we be safer in the water, and how do we look at science in a good avenue, and use science to answer questions. Yep.
Raw emotion, mine is fear. Is there, how, should we be afraid, very afraid, or, I'm just a swimmer, basically, and I prefer not to be prey, so I was wondering, where are we in this spectrum of fear?
From a scientist, I always look at probability.
Right.
And I swim in Cape Cod. I was diving in September off of for work, doing some stuff. And yeah, it's always going to be in the back of my mind. But there's a lot of people on the ocean. There's a lot of people swimming. It's not going to prevent me from going in the water, but it's going to prevent me from jumping in the water if there's a big group of seals. It's going to prevent me from. It's a part of the ocean. The ocean is a dangerous place. It's always been a dangerous place. It's just something that it's going to be in the back of my mind, but it's not going to stop me from jumping in the ocean.
I mean, you say it's always been a dangerous place, but, growing up, I'm, 60 years old, so most of my swimming was done when there weren't any sharks.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is a change. It is definitely a change. How close do they come in?
They'll come. I've seen sharks in several feet of water, but they generally don't like hanging out there because it's a hard place for them to be.
Okay, thanks.
Two questions. Are there orcas in the Gulf of Maine or off the East Coast, and do you expect to see more around Massachusetts?
Yes, there are. They're rare. We had one off of Chatham, I think 2 summers ago, and like fall 2 summers ago. I think his name was Old Tom, and he was a orca known from up in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland area. Orcas are one of the most widely distributed mammals in the world. There's huge pods of them in the Gulf of Mexico. They're a lot of places. They're just not abundant here. If they came back as a more abundant species here, I think it would be a really interesting thing for science and ecology.
As just an average Joe, like I think a lot of us are, how can we support efforts that you folks are doing?
End of the day, talk to managers, talk to politicians to help support shark science, seal science, and science in general, ocean science in general. You can directly support the Center for Coastal Studies by contacting us and either volunteering or many other different manners. We're a nonprofit, so nonprofits generally don't have any cash, but they're.
As a nonprofit, how do you raise your money?
So it's a combination it's generally project-based, especially my department. So it's a combination of town and state and federal and private funding that we are able to solicit. And it's generally based on project. So we just did a project for the town of Nantucket, the seafloor mapping program, mapping an oyster restoration project on Shimo Creek and doing some benthic invertebrate stuff. So we are creating these habitat maps on Cape Cod. The town of Nantucket was curious about their restoration success on their reefs, so we came up with a proposal that they funded, and we went with that. So creatively, we get funded.
When can we find out more about that?
As soon as we're done.
Okay.
We hopefully will have the report to the town within the next couple months. The invertebrate stuff is very time consuming because we get a sample of sand and then we sieve it and everything greater than 1 millimeter stays behind. So we have to sift through all the sand to pick all the little snails and crabs and worms and stuff. And I pulled 2,700 hydropia, which is a tiny snail, out of a sample last week from the Shimo Creek area. It was took a while, but yeah.
So in general, is the shark population stable now, or is it increasing, or how are they doing?
As far as we don't exactly know yet, but it looks like it's been increasing. We don't know how fast, but yeah.
Good.
Any? Yeah.
Well, just last comment from the Nantucket perspective, the Green Mammal Alliance Nantucket. Seals are of course an issue here, and I know you have concerns about swimming. A lot of what we're trying to do is educate. Getting a signage out, having conversations with the stakeholders, everybody from voters to visitors, and let people know that we are in an amazing biodiverse ecosystem here, and we should be really proud of that. And we may have to take precautions. But education is a big first step on that.
Great. Well, thank everyone for coming here. Congratulations. It was a great presentation, Bryan.